So Gloria, thank you so much for the warm welcome. It's really nice to see so many friendly faces. I have to tell you all, it is such a pleasure to come down to Manchester and get to talk in these GMALL series. And I am especially thrilled to be down here tonight because I don't know what you all did this morning, but I woke up and I went down to my local polling place. And I am of an age that when I was in college, I think I didn't think much about issues surrounding women's right to vote and those kinds of things. I think I just assumed that these things were and they would always be that way. And recently, I've been thinking a lot more about those kinds of things. So today seems like a particularly poignant day to get to talk with you all about some of the ladies that have been occupying my imagination recently. So the talk that I'm going to give tonight, the conversation we're going to have, is going to be centered on actually 4 women. I know the advertisement only said 3, but I thought I'd give you all a bonus. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about 4 women who were transformational, not only in the creation of Shelburne Museum, where I work, but they were really, they changed the game in terms of the way that Americans in the middle and sort of second and third quarters of the 20th century thought about decorating. Who has heard the term Colonial Revival before? Great, so we're gonna go over what exactly that is. We're gonna talk through these 4 ladies, and then we're gonna sort of wrap up with what's going on now with all of this. So the 4 women we're gonna talk about tonight. First, we're going to spend a little time on Electra Havemeyer Webb, who some of you may have heard of. She was the founder of Shelburne Museum in the 1940s. Then we're going to spend a little time with this lady, and for those of you who are near the front, if you're near the back, I'm so sorry, you probably can't see it, but she's got this fabulous hat on. Her name is Katherine Prentis Murphy, and she is probably the most fabulous entertainer you've never heard of. We're going to talk a little bit about this woman, Lillian Baker Carlisle. Does that name ring any bells out here? So Lillian was extraordinary and was a name that I sort of heard on the wind as I got started at Shelburne, and I'll talk a little bit tonight about why she's so important. And then finally, this woman down here, a lady named Edith Halpert. Ring any bells? Right? So why do we know about Edith?
Famous collector, dealer.
Yep.
Hanover, maybe?
So she did do her sort of collecting runs through New England, and there are some ties in Hanover that I'll talk about later tonight. So you're spot on. Edith Halpert was a dealer. She was involved both with modern art and with folk art in America. And she's a sort of fascinating woman to think about in terms of how we develop ideas about what American art is. So we'll talk about all of that tonight. To get started, I thought I would share a little bit, just to kind of ground us, about what the heck Shelburne Museum is. Has anyone not been to Shelburne Museum in the room? Oh, great. Oh, all right. Thank you. Are you just raising your hand so that I can, so that I have someone? So Shelburne, right? It's a collection of 39 buildings and structures that's scattered over 45 acres, just a couple hours north of here. And for all intents and purposes, it's sort of a collection of collections. I remember the first time I visited, and I remember looking around and thinking that it seemed a little bit like a Montessori school for adults, right? You could kind of get dumped into this sandbox, and you were free to sort of wander wherever you wanted, and you could sort of open doors, and it was this incredible sort of open-ended experience. And that, in a lot of ways, is what our founder, Electra Havemeyer Webb, wanted to do. When we go back to the early mission statements that she provided for us, some of them are more helpful than others, but my very favorite idea that I try to hold whenever I think about developing exhibitions is that she wanted her museum to be, quote, an educational project, varied and alive. On the one hand, as a curator, I think, thanks a lot for giving me so much great direction. On the other hand, I think, well, this is kind of nice because we're able to be nimble and we're able to sort of think broadly about the kinds of objects that we share with our audiences. So the development of this museum, though, happens in the 1940s, and it ultimately sprang from the same atmosphere that spurred the creation of projects like Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia, Deerfield Village in Massachusetts, and even the Henry Ford Museum outside Detroit. So when you all, has anybody visited any of those institutions? When you go there, what is it that you think of when you go there? What sort of characterizes these places in your mind? Anybody?
Heritage.
Heritage. What else?
At one point, very white, sort of DAR enforcing, but I know Williamsburg has done a lot to work against that. And I'm sure, I've never been to, I'm sure Henry Ford wasn't into that, but I'm sure up in Dearborn it is. And what was the other one you mentioned?
So there's Colonial Williamsburg, Deerfield, Henry Ford. Anybody else? Sort of broad strokes?
Well, the Henry Ford Museum is specific to the automobile industry. It's not as eclectic as Shelburne Museum.
Fair, very fair. So there were these big ideas, and your comment about how some of these organizations sprang from this kind of limited outward viewpoint of sort of who was creating history, who could be an arbiter of what worthwhile history was. It's totally fair, and to be perfectly frank, Shelburne, when it was founded, did not sort of fall that far away from that. Some of the sort of collecting impulses that we'll talk about tonight really sprang from these sort of limited viewpoints, and a lot of our organizations since then have really worked hard to increase the sort of multiplicity of voices that you're hearing when you walk in, and so it's been a kind of ongoing thing, but hindsight's always 20/20, right? I think that understanding where these organizations come from is helpful in terms of thinking about how we can shape them best to move forward. So this museum, right, it's incorporated in 1947, and some of the ideas that Electra Havemeyer Webb was really sort of thinking about, they had been spurred by this larger idea of the Colonial Revival. Now, I mentioned that earlier. Who can tell me briefly what that is? Anybody?
It's a reference to the colonial area.
It is. It's a reference to the colonial era. What else?
Could be said to start at the bicentennial. The centennial, actually, celebration, in Philadelphia in 1876.
Yeah, absolutely.
And where they first started showing things like old Windsor chairs is not attic worthy, and good Philadelphia Chippendale furniture, that kind of thing. It had a lot to do with mistrust of immigration and going back, therefore, to our roots. I'm an ex-librarian. I'm sorry. I'm ex-librarian, history and literature librarian. And going back to our roots to bring back those colonial virtues that the modern age of industrialization has gotten rid of. That's why someone like Gertrude Whitney, starting the modernist Whitney Museum even back in the 20s when it was Whitney Studios, was into folk art and colonial revival.
So you're right. The Colonial Revival, we really get this sort of impulse to move toward this idea of recalling our colonial virtues in 1876 at the centennial. It's a huge exposition. People come from all over North America to view objects there. And it really, it had this kind of singular viewpoint. There was very much, certain people were selected to kind of choose what was displayed. And it was in a lot of ways a place where older styles, past objects, antiques like those Chippendale chairs, also big sort of colonial architectural styles were reworked in the service of educating and elevating public taste. It also served as a reminder to visitors of sort of what their colonial forebears had gone through and what history was. We go through these cycles in American history, well, in any kind of history, really, over time. But what's important to take away from this conversation that we're having is the Colonial Revival, in a lot of ways, while it was really important for sort of thinking about how we shape ideas about history, it was really subjective. It was a creative reworking of history. So there were a number of authors who came out during this time. There was a woman named Helen Comstock, who was the author of the 1962 reference text American Furniture, as well as many other books. But Comstock was considered one of the earliest, most influential voices in American antique collecting and presentation. She happened to be close with Electra Havemeyer Webb, as well as Gertrude Whitney. Alice Winchester was also an editor. She came on board as an assistant to the editor at Antiques Magazine in 1930. Does anybody know about Antiques Magazine? For a long time, it was sort of a major, almost reference publication, and it's still sort of going. So she was promoted to editor in 1939, and she would become one of the most influential voices in antique collecting during the 20th century. She published the work of scholars, curators, and collectors, people like Joseph Downes, who was the head curator at the Met for a long time, people like Charles Montgomery, who was at Winterthur, Nina Fletcher Little, and Helen Comstock, who we just mentioned earlier, who also happened to be a Smith graduate, which I found to be quite a kick. So these are two publications that she put together. And the reason that I put up some pictures of books on the screen is, as many of these collectors, people like Electra Havemeyer Webb, were forming their collections, they had to have a historiography to go back to. And so these books really shaped the way that she installed period rooms, all those kinds of things. So Electra is the young woman in this picture who you see here. This is a pastel by Mary Cassatt, and the lady who's holding her is Louisine Havemeyer. And since we're talking about women and the right to vote today, one of Louisine's sort of great stories, she actively campaigned for the right to vote for women. She was even arrested once and thrown in prison. Electra had to come bail her out, and sort of interestingly, Electra was really embarrassed by this. She was like, "Mom, you got to get it together. I can't come get you out of prison anymore." This is a pastel in our collection of Electra and her mother Louisine that was done by Mary Cassatt. Now, Mary Cassatt was a close friend of Louisine's. And in fact, if you've seen the Impressionist paintings in our museum's collection, many of those were brokered through dealers because of this relationship between Louisine and Mary Cassatt, because she was well connected in Paris. So Electra was born on August 16th, 1888, to Henry Osborne Havemeyer, who was at the time the president of the American Sugar Refining Company. If you know anything about history, you know that the American Sugar Refining Company eventually became Domino Sugar. And so when we think about our own history of our museum, right, and the way that it came to be, there are a lot of questions that we bring up from a curatorial and research perspective where we have to ask, what all does this mean? What kind of legacy does this leave for us, and how do we work constructively with that? She was raised at 740 Park Avenue in New York, and she began to collect in earnest in 1911. Her first purchase was a cigar store Indian, who she named Mary O'Connor, after her governess. Now, it's interesting, we're in the midst of reinstalling Stagecoach Inn, which is where most of our folk art collections are kept. And we have a figure that we think is Mary O'Connor, but there are some questions about her. So she's actually going through conservation testing right now and evaluation, so we can maybe get some answers. There will be more on that in 2021 when we open up that building. So this house, has anyone ever been out to the brick house? So this is the brick house. This is the house that was gifted to Electra and her young husband, James Watson Webb, in 1913 when they got married. So this structure is actually located out on the property at Shelburne Farms, which I'm sure some of you have been to before. It's sort of out past the breeding barn, and the grounds overlook, they look west toward the lake and to the Adirondacks. It is an extraordinary property, one that is filled, and will be filled in a few months, with hundreds of peonies. So it's, you can sort of imagine this like fragrant, beautiful, breezy location. Electra Havemeyer Webb restored this 1840s farmhouse and turned it ultimately into a 40-room home that they lived in until her passing in 1960. This wasn't their only house. They had an estate at Westbury, Long Island, and also a family home in Connecticut. But this was the main home that Electra used as a sort of design laboratory. Now, she was gifted this house in 1913, but it would take her decades to sort of get to a point where she was happy with the decoration. So this is an image of the dining room, and you can start to see, you see some of those peonies here, but you also see a lot of pattern, right, with these sort of woven rugs. There's even pattern carved into the mantelpiece. This table that's here was actually a custom-made table that had leaves that would allow it to expand. That's there right now. It's made out of tiger maple. This is the living room. And here again, you see that kind of use of pattern with these really lovely sort of embroidered chairs. If you look out to the hallway, you see little examples of folk art, local painting. This is Electra Havemeyer Webb's bedroom. And if you have good eyesight, you'll spy this over the mantle. This is actually a portrait of Louisine that was done by Mary Cassatt. It's a pastel, so this, believe it or not, in the picture is a facsimile because we can't leave a pastel hanging up like this. But again, you see all of this pattern. What you can't tell from here, this is a door right here that actually opens onto a beautiful porch that overlooks the lake. So the reason I'm showing you these pictures, and here's another image of the sort of hallways, I want to convey, for those of you who haven't had a chance to visit, this idea of a design laboratory. Electra was using all sorts of patterned wall coverings, floor coverings, textiles for her furniture, decorative items, prints, sculptures, all that kind of good stuff. And she was basically layering these objects upon each other in ways that would just provide this sort of visual panoply of things to look at. This is an aesthetic that she carried over into the museum ultimately. When you think about how that museum is layered as a kind of collection of collections, it very much sort of carries through. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is. The museum, believe it or not, though, actually started as a collection of 28 carriages and other kinds of horse-drawn vehicles from the estate of her in-laws. In 1946, they were thinking about getting rid of all of these vehicles, and Electra said, no, 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 you don't have to get rid of these things. If you just give them to me, I'll start a museum. So it's not so far off from the impetus of starting the Henry Ford, although it did grow to encompass much more than these objects. This is a particularly beautiful sleigh that was actually made in Montreal, and when I look at this, I can't get enough. It's just the sexiest sleigh I've ever seen. It's so lovely. So to understand the sort of formation of the museum from this collection of vehicles, I think is an important one. It's a little idiosyncratic, but not that different from what her peers were doing at the time. So this is an interesting picture. This is an early director, Sterling Emerson, who was giving a press conference with WCAX in the 1950s. So this, we still have this, believe it or not. I love these old dioramas. They're so much fun. But in here you can see the covered bridge. So this was taken from the Lamoille River. It was deconstructed piece by piece and then put back together over our own little sort of water feature. You can also see over here the steamboat Ticonderoga, and right in front of it, the lighthouse. Down here is Horseshoe Barn, where all of those, it was a purpose-built structure for all of those vehicles to be housed in. And then the sort of rest of the museum grounds as they were in the 1950s. This is Electra. And it's one of my favorite pictures of her. There's another portrait where she's standing next to this like 10-foot tall grizzly bear that she shot and then had stuffed. But I think that the sheer look of determination on this woman's face is one that we should all take note of today. She decided that she wanted to have a steamboat in her museum. And in the early 1950s, the Ticonderoga was still operating as a pleasure cruiser on Lake Champlain. As it is with many boats, the folks who administered it realized that it was really sort of like a hole in the water that they were throwing money into. It wasn't cost effective to run. And they were going to decommission it. And Electra said, no, 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 you should just let me buy it. So she purchases it in 1953. She operates it on Lake Champlain for a year and realizes, oh yeah, I'm really not getting the return on investment I had hoped for with this. So she decides, you know, what else are you going to do with a boat? Over the winter of 1954 to 55, she drags it 2 miles overland on these sort of custom-built railroad tracks from Shelburne Bay all the way to the museum. So the picture that you're looking at here, this you can tell that it is sort of the winter, right? So the boat has come out of Shelburne Bay. They've dug this huge sort of area for it and then drained it. And you can see the tracks sort of beginning. See, I think I have another one, right? This is a picture of it actually moving the 2 miles over land. So this is the Colchester Lighthouse that was already sort of in place. I really love this because you get the idea that the boat is sort of heading toward its lighthouse. Anyhow, if you sort of look at this, though, you get the idea that this was not a small undertaking. And just as they were sort of getting near to getting the boat into place, there was this freak thaw, perhaps like the weather we're having right now. And the ship started to list. And they were really concerned that it would sort of go over and there would be nothing they could do. But it eventually was moved into place. This is another really great picture where you sort of get the sense of just how immense this undertaking was. I love this. Again, every ship needs its lighthouse. So this was actually, it was built on the Colchester Reef in Lake Champlain in 1871. It comes to the museum, though, in 1952, just before the boat. And it's been a really interesting object on campus for us. There is a fascinating working light in the top of it that we sometimes use with educational groups to think about sort of STEM ideas and sort of how technology like this works. For a long time, there was an exhibit about Champ in here, Champ, the lake monster. And when it was originally opened by Electra, it was filled with all sorts of maritime objects. So scrimshaw, prints, all sorts of other things related to boats. Electra also, you're getting the idea, right? She collected all sorts of things, not just objects, but buildings, structures. She even made up stories. And this is a picture, one of her early promotional shots, of A. Tuckaway's General Store. A. Tuckaway, I love it. She made up these sort of fictional characters who were the people who served as the protagonists in her imagined narratives for guests. She had other fictional personalities, my very favorite of which is the sea captain, quote, of some fame and means who had traveled the 7 seas. He supposedly lived in Vermont House, which is the building that houses most of our furniture collections, or at least the ones that we have on display. And something that it was really interesting, about 20 years ago, the museum decided to reinstall that building. And they took away the fictional narrative of the sea captain. And the education department was barraged by letters of people who had come to the museum as children, who were disappointed because they thought that the sea captain, it had been their favorite part of the experience, right? This sort of imagined guy. So it's sort of interesting when we think about things like that. It's good fun as a curator. So this is the interior of A. Tuckaway's General Store. You can still go in this today, and it looks like this. Believe it or not, this is also attached to an apothecary, and our apothecary is one of the most problematic spaces on our campus, because when it was purchased, many of the vials and containers were, of course, early medicinal vials and containers, and many of them still contain hazardous substances. So it is an ongoing kind of conservation and security management thing that we work with. So those collections aren't always so straightforward. We also have a weaving shop that Electra built. One of the things that I love about our weaving shop is that it was purpose-built, but it was located near gardens that contain traditional dye ingredients, things like indigo and woad. So when we have guests who come to the museum, Electra wanted them to be able to get sort of the idea of the whole picture. We have places like the blacksmith shop. Again, these were some of those early promotional photos from the 50s. And one of the things I think that's so great about the blacksmith shop, I love this sort of engagement here with the kids. But we have volunteers today who work in the shop with their grandparents' tools that were donated to the museum. I'm getting a little choked up, right? That, I think, is an extraordinary kind of link with our community. And it's one that was important to Electra, sort of maintaining those ideas of sort of grounding right here where we are. There's also the sawmill. There's this fabulous train. These promotional shots, when I was going through the archives and looking for them, I love this with all of these kids just climbing all over it. This engine was built in 1915, and fun fact, was the last coal-burning steam 10-wheeler used on the Central Vermont Railway. Number 220 became known as the locomotive of presidents because it pulled special trains carrying people like Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, Franklin Roosevelt, and even Dwight D. Eisenhower. It was retired from service in 1956 and then gifted to the Museum for Preservation. There were also houses like this that Electra collected. This is Prentis House. It was a structure that was built in Hadley, Massachusetts in 1773 and relocated to the museum in 1955 to serve as this sort of idea of a representative colonial home. And you know, if you've toured historic New England houses, this is a very familiar looking kind of salt box construction, right? But what's really interesting about this house is that instead of decorating it herself, Electra handed it over to her friend and colleague, Katherine Prentis Murphy. And that is the fabulous woman who you see right here. So Murphy was born in 1882, so she was a contemporary of Electra Havemeyer Webb. She came to have this really outsized influence on the Colonial Revival aesthetic because she was an aggressive collector. She entertained with her antiques. She wasn't afraid to use her ceramics or glassware. And she was very involved in placing her collections, or her objects, in important collections like the New York Historical Society, the New Hampshire Historical Society, Bayou Bend down in Houston, and even Shelburne Museum. So Murphy believed that her installations represented, and here's to your point, quote, wealthy people of extreme good taste from America's colonial past. These were obviously fictions. But I think when we work to understand history and when we work to understand why we think, how we think about the world around us, understanding the perspective that people like Katherine were coming from is important because it helps us pull apart why we think what we think. So this was her home. This was known as Candlelight Farm. It's located in Westbrook, Connecticut, and much like the brick house was for Electra, Candlelight Farm was a sort of laboratory for settings that Katherine Prentis Murphy used for entertaining. So you would come to her house, and the stories, there were so many stories about her entertaining. You would pull up, and her butler would meet you with a cocktail, and then you would get to have cocktail hour on the back porch, and then you would come inside to the parlor or the dining room. So this is the parlor. This was an image that was published in Antiques magazine in October 1950. Now you see why I gave you some pictures of boring books. So the idea that these interiors, right, were being published in the middle of the 20th century as these kind of factually accurate historic interiors changes the way that we think about decorating. I remember when I started my master's, this was what I thought historic rooms must look like, right? In anticipation, though, of a major gift to the New York Historical Society, Antiques ran all of these images of Katherine's interiors. So Katherine had been working with curators to sort of gift this collection up. And so they printed these in full color. So what you'll notice about these, you've got lots of heavy colonial furniture, right? These big sort of sideboards that look sort of English. She had big portraits. You'll notice these brass candlesticks. You'll also notice in a lot of Katherine Prentis Murphy's rooms these sort of oriental carpets, right? These were not factually correct, but she really liked them. And so she put them into all of her rooms, and they ended up carrying over into the way that collectors like Henry Francis DuPont decorated those rooms, right? So think about this, right? It's almost like a domino effect. One person starts doing this, the images get published, and all of a sudden everyone picks up the design trend. So this, again, you see this wonderful use of carpets. This was the dining room at Candlelight Farm. A couple other things to note, these wonderful sort of banister back chairs with all these beautiful turnings. Big Delftware plates on the side. So you're gonna see a lot of blue and white china in her houses. Again, more portraits of our ancestors. And then heavy, big drapes, right? This is another view of that room. Again, you see more china like this. This was one of the chambers upstairs from in Candlelight Farm. And again, here you see this big William and Mary high chest, these beautiful sort of embroidered crewel work bed hangings, right? Bed hangings were meant to actually be closed around a bed so that it could keep you warm at night when it was chilly. But these were the kinds of bed hangings that if you were just an average person during the 18th century, you didn't have things like this. This was for the fanciest of houses. So eventually, she gifts most of these rooms as rooms to the New York Historical Society. This happens in 1951, and it gained a lot of attention. It also sort of bears commenting that Katherine Prentis Murphy, she didn't come from a sort of wealthy background on her own. She married young, and her husband passed away. And he had done quite well for himself. And so she basically used a lot of that sort of injection of capital early on to collect and then to use that collecting to sort of bolster her connections within social circles. So this was very much a kind of patrician activity, right, that she was participating in. So this is the frontispiece to the gift of the exhibition at the New York Historical Society in April 1951. So this house itself, it was built in 1773. The interiors of it have remained mostly unchanged since the 1950s. And it is ultimately one of only 2 intact examples of Katherine Prentis Murphy's designed rooms. So I'll show you some of these interiors. This is the interior of Prentis House at the museum. Now you'll notice this big, again, the William and Mary high chest. These wonderful sort of flamework embroidered chairs. If you check out this floor, notice it's not an oriental carpet, but there were floors at the New York Historical Society, not New York, at the New Hampshire Historical Society that she was really interested in this kind of checkerboard grid work. And so it was sort of a design choice that she made. These floors actually were not originally painted this color, but about 20 years ago when this house was sort of zhuzhed up, the then director decided that we were going to paint those floors. So there have been some small adjustments. But you really get the same sort of feel from these rooms at Shelburne Museum that you did from the sort of model rooms at Candlelight Farm. Here is the dining room in Prentis House. Again, the Delftware over the big sideboard, the same kind of placement. I love all these sort of hefty embroidered curtains. What do you see down here? More oriental carpets. And again, those scrollwork bed hangings, right? So almost sort of room for room, Katherine Prentis Murphy was taking inspiration from these early installations and then just repeating them over and over again. She and her brother also donated a number of pieces of furniture to Shelburne Museum. And one of the most important, I noticed it was actually featured on the front of the GMALL brochure. This is our Harvard chest. And when we think about the history of furniture, so this is part of a very small group of known objects. We think there are 6 to 8 pieces in existence that include decorations of buildings that early on were thought to be buildings at Harvard College, which is why this gained the name the Harvard chest. We don't actually know where the buildings were from, and there is a really lovely curator right now who's working on debunking some of those myths. So if I come back later, maybe I'll be able to share. But again, the idea that this was a hefty piece of furniture that had a long lineage in North America that was associated in some way with this, most hallowed of institutions was another way that Murphy's collecting was really girding up that idea of her objects representing a certain kind of well-bred New England lineage. So it's sort of interesting to think about from that perspective. In addition, if you look at all the decorative finishes on this, there were other objects at Shelburne Museum that these complemented. They weren't so different from our textile collection. So an early visitor to the museum would have actually seen our quilts and bed covers displayed like this. Has anyone been recently? Not recently. Well, we're doing a really bang-up show this summer. You should all come see. But I work on textiles probably 30% of the time at the museum. And it's really interesting when I work with some of our older quilts in the Hat and Fragrance galleries, I can tell which ones were original to Electra Havemeyer Webb's time. Because if you notice here, so these big pages, these were essentially just like plywood boards. And there were frames that went around them. And Electra's quilts would get sandwiched in here and then stapled in for security. So when I pull out objects to assess for exhibition, I often will find these little holes from those old staples in these textiles. Now, we would not display them that way now, but one of the sort of ongoing conversations we've had is, how do we display textiles in a way that honors some of these early ideas, but that's also better for our objects? So this brings me to the importance of sort of pattern, right? Remember those pictures of brick house I was showing you all earlier? All of the wall coverings, all of the floor coverings. These kinds of bed coverings were the same way. So this is a picture from the early 1950s in our hat and fragrance galleries. And the women who you see here, this is Lillian Baker Carlisle. She's our third lady of the evening. And this is, again, Electra. So Lillian began working for Mrs. Webb on May 23rd, 1951. And I feel like she's one of the great unsung heroes of our institution. About Mrs. Webb, she said, quote, "She was very interesting looking. She was very simply dressed. She had this lovely white hair, and she seemed quite sure of herself. I was quite sure of myself, too. I was her secretary, her librarian, her researcher. I was everything. Whatever came up, I did." Now, early on, Lillian encountered some challenges. There were a number of folks who were part of the administrative team at the museum who were a little envious of the proximity that Lillian kept to Electra. And after Electra's passing, something was really interesting. There's a young woman who just wrote a book on Lillian Baker Carlisle. And in Lillian's memoirs, she talks a little bit about her sort of uncomfortable departure from the museum. After Mrs. Webb passed away, rather than having direct collection access, she had been a cataloger, she had been a collector. She spent about a year working on menial tasks and was eventually pushed out. She then went into Vermont politics. So I feel like she's a great woman to sort of invoke today. So these are sort of two examples of objects that were donated by Lillian to the collection. And I won't focus much on our textiles today, but this is a big sort of pieced quilt. And this is one of our lovely sort of overshot woven coverlets. Lillian researched all sorts of things in the collection. She also was in charge of sort of the hatbox collection. These were some pictures that were taken for Time magazine early on, and they sort of show her and Mrs. Webb interacting. It's interesting, these panels that you see behind them, these were actually coverings on hat boxes that had been unrolled. Electra would take apart these objects and sort of use them as design inspiration. Here are some details, in fact, from some of those hat boxes, right? The squirrels are pretty wonderful. If you know about printing, you know that these were all probably roller printed or wood block printed. But we have, if you go into our hat and fragrance galleries, our textile galleries are called the hat and fragrance galleries. And part of the reason that they're called that is because there was a room that contained all these hat boxes, and in the hat boxes were all of these sachets that had this nice little fragrance. And so they were, meant to keep moths away, all that kind of stuff. But all of these sort of wonderful hat boxes are in there. And something that I think is really important about Lillian is that she was one of the first people to write about the collection. Now, as someone who really enjoys writing, I am really inspired by researchers who are prolific in their work. Her first book, Lillian's first book, was actually co-authored with the Webb family friend and author Ralph Nading Hill, who some of you may have heard of because of his writing for Vermont Life. So her first book was titled The Story of Shelburne Museum, and she noted, quote, "The books were the growing edge of the museum. Through the series, people could see all the marvelous exhibits at the museum without having to step foot on the campus." So she understood, right, the idea of distance learning early on. Between 1960 and Lillian's passing in 2006, she authored 8 books and dozens of articles on topics as varied as textiles, silver, clocks, watches, silversmiths, patterned glass, hats and bandboxes, shell work, wax dolls, hair work, and more. She was an avid reader, an avid researcher, and believe it or not, this is a really sweet story. So in 2005 and 2006, this space in the Hat and Fragrance Gallery, so these are lots of hat and bandboxes, was slated for a reinstallation. And Lillian Baker Carlisle was invited to come in as the sort of acting advisor to the project. the room was installed. She sort of let our curators know sort of how she thought it should be done. And just before, like literally the day before these rooms opened to the public, Lillian passed away. So I walk through these rooms and I think a lot about the legacy of these sort of really dedicated friends of the museum that we've had for forever who've shaped the way that we see our objects. So the last woman I'm going to talk with you all about tonight is Edith Halpert. And she is a woman who perhaps has most recently come into our consciousness. There was a great exhibition that the Jewish Museum put up this year called Edith Halpert and the Rise of American Art. It closed last month, but it was a real showstopper. And as I started to learn about Edith, I was really just blown away by how transformative her influence was on the field that I work in. So she was born in Odessa, Russia. She was a sort of contemporary to Electra Havemeyer Webb and all of these other women. She immigrates to New York, and she immediately begins working. She works in marketing at Macy's. She slowly sort of works her way up the chain. She learns how to sell things. And then she decides that she is going to take up the cause of American modernist painting. Now, this might not sound like a big deal to anyone right now, but in the 1920s and in the 1930s, there were no galleries in New York that were exhibiting the work of living American artists. Edith was the first one to put together a space where people like Stuart Davis, Yasuo Kuniyoshi, Jacob Lawrence, Ben Shahn, Charles Sheeler, and even eventually Georgia O'Keeffe were displayed. These are the names that we think of when we think about modernist painting in America. And there was absolutely no one at the time who was sort of prepared to support these artists, really to sort of keep them moving over time. So Edith supported all of these folks. And when she decided that she would sort of open her gallery in 1926, it was open as the sort of first commercial art space in Bohemian Greenwich Village. In 1929, what happens in 1929? Yeah, right, we've all been thinking about that recently. So in 1929, following the stock market crash, in addition to sort of her gallery downstairs, she opens what's known as the American Folk Art Gallery upstairs. So her downstairs gallery was known as the Downtown Gallery, and that was where these modernist paintings were displayed. But after the stock market crash, her usual buyers, people like Electra Havemeyer Webb or Gertrude Whitney, couldn't afford to purchase works from her, or they chose not to. And so Edith, forever the marketer, realized that she needed to find objects that were available at lower price points for her audiences. So what she did was she purchased a Packard, and she would go on these long drives through New England, where she would stop at farms. She would see an interesting weather vane on top of a barn or a piece of decorative metal, and she would stop and she would offer to pay the owners for these objects. Well, if you're living in sort of Depression-era America, and there is this woman who shows up from New York City at the front of your drive and says, I want to buy that thing off your barn, you know, it seems like a reasonable offer, right? So she would take these objects back to New York, she would clean them up, and ultimately she became sort of the person who was catering to people like Abby Aldrich Rockefeller and Electra Havemeyer Webb. So when you come to our museum and you see collections of weather vanes, heck, when you look at sales at Christie's or Sotheby's and there are these big folk art sales, it was really Edith who built the market for these things. She also sold plenty of works to Electra Havemeyer Webb. So the final collection that Electra put together was her collection of American painting. And this is an early picture of some of the sort of opening days of Webb Gallery. If you come to the museum now, Webb Gallery is the small brick building that's located sort of down the hill from the entrance. And it's where we keep our collection of American pictures. When they were originally installed, though, there was also furniture in these galleries. And Electra, in a lot of ways, was sort of clicking off the major artists that were sort of known in American art. So she had to have a painting by John Singleton Copley. The thing that I love most about this painting actually is not the painting, but it's the frame around it. For those of you who know anything about John Singleton Copley, You may know that he carved and designed his own frames for quite a period of time. And we think, given the sort of stickers and so on the back of this picture, that this was probably an original Copley designed frame. It's really delicate, but we feel so lucky to have it. So there were also paintings like this, academic works by artists like Edward Lamson Henry. And Edward Lamson Henry, does anybody know that name? So he's a really interesting guy. He was an early preservationist in the sort of 19th century in Philadelphia. He was one of those folks who, after the Centennial Exposition, really promoted the preservation of, whole tracts of land in Old City Philadelphia. So these classic Philadelphia townhouses that you think of that are filmed with all of this lovely Chippendale furniture. Not only was he lobbying politically to support these kinds of places by the idea of zoning and that kind of stuff, but he was collecting the objects that would go in them and then painting them in these sort of lovely historic interiors. So this picture is called A Lover of Old China, and I always kind of feel like Edward Lamson Henry was sort of a precursor to Norman Rockwell, right? Like there are these really feel-good pictures of just like these sort of interiors you can climb right into. In addition to those academic paintings, though, Webb Gallery included work by contemporary American artists. So this is a painting by Grandma Moses, and I was here earlier today. I had a chance to come down early to do a little bit of work in SBAC's collection. I was talking with Anne and Anna Maria, and Anna Maria, the collections manager here, mentioned that there was this really interesting material related to Grandma Moses that she'd run across in the archives upstairs. And it was in 1960, August 8th, 1960, there was a play put on in honor of Grandma Moses' 100th birthday here as a benefit at the Southern Vermont Arts Center. And upstairs, I'm not even lying to you, is a whole transcript of the play, complete with music. It is amazing. Anyway, I was really excited about this. So, Grandma Moses, she's born in Cambridge, New York. She begins painting at the ripe young age of 83, and she gets represented by Gallery Saint Etienne in New York. A guy named Otto Collier really sort of puts her out there. She becomes popular in the 1950s, and that's a time when, frankly, the US government is looking to American artists who are creating a sort of quintessentially American view. And Grandma Moses fit a lot of that. She was technically untrained, although in truth, Otto Collier was supplying a lot of her early art supplies. And she became good friends both with Electra Havemeyer Webb and a number of other collectors sort of here in the area. I can't wait to see what you guys do with the sort of tableau vivant situation. It's amazing. So there was Grandma Moses. So keep in mind, so there's the Copley, there's the Edward Lamson Henry, there's all this Grandma Moses painting. But then there were also things like this. So the picture that you're seeing here, this is actually a portrait of William and Marguerite Zorak with one of William Zorak's sculptures of mother and child. Now you might say, Katie, I've never seen that at Shelburne Museum. And that is a good point. Because some of the last art purchases that Electra made, so it was Edith Halpert who connected Electra with the Zoraks. And she ultimately brokered this because the Zoraks were one of the artists that she was representing at the Downtown Gallery. Electra purchases 13 works near the end of her life. And they were all works by modernists. So she purchased this mother and child sculpture. She also purchased Georgia O'Keeffe's Poppies, which is now in Milwaukee. She also purchased a number of works by Stuart Davis and Yasuo Kuniyoshi. So we had this sort of budding small collection of contemporary art that was meant to sort of play with her collections of folk art and academic American painting. Unfortunately, in 1961, Electra has a stroke and passes away. And her son, James Watson Webb Jr., decides that these works do not fit with the collection. He returns all but one of them to Edith. The one that he keeps, does anybody know? It's the only really sort of like modernist work we've had for a long time. It was Andrew Wyeth's Soaring. So the last time I saw you all, maybe 2 times ago, we talked a little bit about Wyeth's works. But that, for a long time, was the most contemporary work in our collection. So it's sort of interesting that we're now sort of building that up. Now we've got works by Francis Colburn and Paul Sample and Henry Schnackenberg, and I think that's another lecture. Anyhow, so there were works like this that Edith brought to Electra. There were also paintings like this. You might have noticed our Lawson family before in the galleries. Edith was heavily invested, as a Russian immigrant herself, in the idea that it was important to represent people who were not just male and white in her artworks that she was selling and brokering. And so she took a chance on a lot of works that she eventually sold. This is an interesting picture. So this was actually purchased by, Electra Havemeyer Webb purchased this from a guy named Maxim Karalik, who donated a huge collection of materials to the Boston MFA and eventually also sold works to Shelburne Museum. But before Maxim had these pictures, they had been sold by Edith. So there were all of these people who were circulating in these sort of groups that just, it was like everyone was talking to each other. We've got these great portraits. In addition to informing the installations at Webb Gallery, most of the objects that Electra was purchasing from Edith Halpert were installed in Stagecoach Inn. So this is a sort of seasonally appropriate picture of Stagecoach. The next time anyone visits will be after the renovation. So in 2021, I would encourage everyone to come back for this. We're in the midst right now of planning for the layout and so on, and we'll be telling some of these stories in those installations. But it's amazing when we look at the objects that have been housed in here, what an aggressive stamp Edith left on the institution. She contributed, she not only would send objects on spec to Electra, eventually she was on our board of trustees. She even contributed early ideas to the layout of the first rooms, and she wrote wall labels for these objects. So she really was actively shaping the way that she wanted viewers to experience them. So there were things like this. So this little sculpture of George Washington on horseback. He's only about this big. He's not too big. But he's a good example of early sculpture. And as someone who spent a lot of time thinking about sculptural history, right? When I think about this, I think about precedents like, I don't know, Marcus Aurelius on horseback, right? They're not quite the same, but they are comparative. And when we think about the building of a narrative in visual history, objects like this are important. There are also objects like these. So these are the remaining 6 pins from a set of 9 pins, which was a sort of 18th, early 19th century game that you could play sort of like bowling. Again, you'll notice here, not everyone is Anglo-Saxon. And it's sort of interesting that these objects came through Edith. Many of these objects were also included in a project known as the American Index of Design. Does that ring a bell with anyone? So early in the century, sort of following the Great Depression, there were artists all over the nation who were put to work by state projects, sort of federally funded and then administered by the states. But it was part of the WPA, and many of these programs put artists back to work. So there's actually a beautiful watercolor of these 9 pens that lives at the National Gallery in Washington. These early installations at Stagecoach Inn included objects like trade signs, more weather vanes. So again, imagine her sort of driving up to a house and haggling for something on top of your barn and then trying to get it down. One of the things that we're working with on these right now, because Edith altered the surface finishes of so many of these, one of the big questions we've had with our new installations as we work to treat objects is, okay, so if we can look at an object and we can tell that the surface finish on it is not original, how far back does it go? Did Electra purchase it and did it look like this? Or was it treated at a later date? And so as we ask questions like that, it really affects the choices that we will make working with conservators to get these objects ready for display. It's a lot about choosing which stories are the most important to tell or which we think give us the most latitude. There were also rooms full of things like this. So most of these, so this is our statue of a pilgrim, which we think was originally connected to a ship. This, believe it or not, figure of Columbia, she is a weather vane mold, which is sort of terrific. So she's carved in wooden, who was eventually converted into garden statuary. Big sculptures like this of George Washington, right? You have to have lots of founding fathers. And of course, eagles. We have lots of eagles in our collection, so many birds. it feels a little overwhelming sometimes. But we're working through a lot of those right now to sort of figure out what to do with these collections and how to really share them with the public. So some of these also started out as architectural ornament that was repurposed as interior sculpture. And then finally, what I thought I would leave you with, Edith also had a hand in selling Electra many of her carousel figures. Now, as a curator, this picture makes my skin crawl just a little bit. I'm thrilled for the kids in this picture. It looks like they're having a great time, but I'm terrified for the sculpture. So these initially, these were sort of some of our Denzel carousel animals. For those of you who know anything about carousel figures, Gustav Denzel was a German immigrant to Philadelphia who is sort of one of the most famous carousel figure carvers. Electra ended up purchasing a whole Denzel carousel and was going to display it outside. Her insurers told her no. They said, this is not something you want to have outside. So she ended up actually salvaging the figures and installing them originally in the attic of Stagecoach Inn. Now you can go into our circus building and see them. Another fun fact, if any of you are divers, there was one winter when we realized that, this was many, many moons ago, that we had all of these carousel parts that we weren't using. They had saved the Wurlitzer on the inside. They'd saved all of the painted rounding boards. They'd saved all of the animals in the carriages. But they had all these sort of framing members, and they didn't know what to do with them. Can anyone guess what happened? They were waltzed out on the ice one winter in Lake Champlain. And when the ice thawed, they sank. And I'm sure these were not the first or the last things to be dumped in Lake Champlain, but it was, there's a carousel down there. I love thinking about this. So these were some early sort of pictures of Stagecoach Inn, all the fun you could have at Shelburne. And I thought what I would do is leave you with a picture of the carousel that we have outside now. So this is a working carousel. We're actually in the process of building a structure over it. So when we open on May 1st to the public again for the season, we will have a beautiful structure that will sort of maintain all of this. But I thought just to conclude, these four women who I've spent tonight talking with you about, Shelburne Museum wouldn't be what it is without their influence. In addition, I don't think we would think the way that we do about our sort of colonial material culture heritage without the influence of these people. So they had these outsized legacies that continue to inform the way that we understand all of these historic spaces, not only in our institutions, but maybe in our homes too, in the way that we live with these objects. So that's what I have for you all tonight. And I've got a little bit of time, I think, to take questions if anyone has them. No questions?
I can really add that my family collected antiques. We were down in New Jersey cards too. And then we bought an apple orchard in Addison, which my mother, so we were there in 57, which was heavily influenced by American heritage flair and style at the time. So it's all very familiar, and I'm kind of ready for stuff.
Well,
Really, that's exactly where it came from.
yeah, it is. So I grew up, it's funny, I think about how I might have gotten involved with all of this. I remember when I was a sophomore and I called my parents to be like, I'm gonna be an art historian. And they were are you sure, honey? But my grandmother was an antiques dealer. And I remember hanging out in her house as a kid. And there were certain rooms, granted, I grew up in a big Southern family, but there were certain rooms that you only went into on like Christmas and Easter, right? And you had to be very careful not to bring food into those rooms. But I think a lot about the way that we live with these objects and the way that we think about them today, right? One of the kind of current issues that I think about a lot, because we get a lot of phone calls to the museum from folks who have these objects, their kids don't want them. They call us and they say, what can we do? What can we do with these objects? Many museums are full. Decorative arts take up a lot of space. And so, a lot of people have asked, what are we going to do with all of our brown furniture? is this going to continue? Are our kids going to keep buying knockoff Ames chairs? Like, what's going on? Why does everyone want this sort of spare 1960s furniture? It also has affected the market. I remember when I was in graduate school and there were these sort of record prices being achieved by things like Philadelphia High Chest selling at Sotheby's. You can buy these objects now for a fraction of the cost. I cannot tell you the number of times I've come home from Merrill's and my husband is like, oh no, not again. But it's this kind of, where are all these objects going to go? Will the sort of clock come around again? Will they become fashionable? And I think there is a sort of young generation right now. There have been a couple stories in like the New York Times about young 20-something collectors who are, they're making it chic again. So who knows what will happen. But, well, thank you all for taking some time out of your evening to come.